The sound of gunfire in Africa rarely makes the evening news anymore. It has become background noise to the world. Yet somewhere in the Sahel, a mother still waits for a son who will never return. In Sudan, in Congo, in Burkina Faso, villages are emptied not by drought alone, but by bullets fired by men who often don't even know why they are fighting. Brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. And the world watches in silence. Burkina Faso is at war. That much is undeniable. But as President Ibrahim Traoré has warned, the real battlefield is not only in the forests or along the borders. It is in the minds of people. Wars like these do not start naturally. They are fed, fueled with money, weapons, ammunition, and false promises often sent quietly from far beyond Africa's borders. Those pulling the strings rarely bleed. It is ordinary Africans who pay the price. When we look back at history, the pain deepens. Sudan, Congo, the Sahel. Different names, same story. External interests step in, divisions are sharpened, and suddenly communities are torn apart. This is not chaos by accident, it is chaos by design. And today, Burkina Faso stands at the center of a storm that could reshape all of West Africa. Recent tensions between Burkina Faso and Nigeria, following the seizure of a Nigerian military aircraft and its crew, have raised alarms across the region. ECOWAS is involved. Foreign powers are watching closely. And President Ibrahim Traoré has made one thing clear: Burkina Faso will not bow, intimidate, or surrender its sovereignty. For some, this stance feels dangerous. For others, it feels long overdue. So, here is the uncomfortable question we must ask ourselves. Is Africa being pushed toward another devastating conflict? Or is this the moment Africans finally choose dignity over submission? Can nations like Burkina Faso truly chart an independent path, or will history repeat itself once again under a different name? This is not just Africa news. This is a global warning. What happens in Burkina Faso today may define the future of Africa tomorrow. If you believe these stories matter, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's stand will bring peace or provoke greater danger? Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines, and share this video if you feel the world needs to pay attention. Across Africa, the pattern is painfully familiar. Violence erupts, headlines flash briefly, and then attention fades. But on the ground, the consequences remain. In Burkina Faso, as in Sudan and Congo, the wars tearing communities apart are not simply the result of ancient rivalries or uncontrollable chaos. They are conflicts shaped, sustained, and manipulated by forces far removed from the villages that burn and the families that mourn. In the Sahel, armed men move through the countryside with weapons they did not manufacture, fuel they did not refine, and money they did not earn. Many of them barely understand the political slogans they repeat. They are told who the enemy is handed a rifle and sent to kill people who look just like them. Brothers are turned against brothers. Neighbors are made into enemies. This is not an accident of history. It is a system that has repeated itself across Africa for decades. Burkina Faso now finds itself directly confronting this reality. President Ibrahim Traoré has spoken openly about the origins of the violence facing his country, arguing that instability does not grow in isolation. It is fed from outside, nurtured by interests that profit when Africa is divided, weakened, and distracted by endless internal conflict. While ordinary citizens suffer displacement, hunger, and fear, those who benefit sit comfortably elsewhere, calculating influence and access to resources. The situation intensified when tensions emerged between Burkina Faso and Nigeria following the interception of a Nigerian Air Force aircraft that allegedly entered Burkina Bay airspace without authorization. According to authorities in Burkina Faso, the aircraft was grounded, and 11 personnel on board were detained for investigation amid suspicions of espionage. Nigeria insisted the flight was en route to Portugal, yet Burkina Faso demanded concrete proof that, according to officials, was never adequately provided. This moment marked a turning point. For Burkina Faso, releasing the aircraft without clear answers would have signaled weakness. President Ibrahim Traoré refused to do so. He reminded the region of a similar case in 2023 involving a French aircraft that took nearly a year to resolve through diplomatic channels. The message was simple, and firm sovereignty is not negotiable even when pressure comes from a fellow African nation. The reaction across West Africa was immediate. Supporters of Burkina Faso saw the decision as an overdue assertion of dignity, a sign that African states could finally say no without apology. Critics, however, warned that the standoff risked escalation, especially given Nigeria's influence within ECOWAS and its status as Africa's most populous country. What began as a security incident quickly evolved into a broader political test. At the heart of the controversy lies a deeper question. Is Nigeria acting solely in the interest of regional stability, or is it responding to external pressures? Among many citizens in the Sahel, suspicions run deep. France's diminished presence in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger has left a vacuum, and some believe that influence is now being exercised indirectly through regional institutions and allied governments. Whether proven or not, this perception carries weight and danger. President Ibrahim Traoré's response was unusually direct. He stated that if Burkina Faso's territory were violated, his country would defend itself without hesitation. This was not framed as a declaration of war, but as a declaration of resolve. For supporters of the alliance of Sahel states Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, it echoed the defiant spirit of Thomas Sankara, a refusal to bow even when the odds appear stacked. For ordinary Africans watching from Ouagadougou to Bamako, from Niamey to Accra, this episode feels larger than a single aircraft or diplomatic dispute. It represents a confrontation between two visions of Africa's future. One vision accepts quiet pressure compromise without consent and security shaped by outside interests. The other insists on self-determination even when the cost is high. This is why the events unfolding in Burkina Faso matter far beyond its borders. They expose the mechanics of modern conflict in Africa and force a difficult reckoning. Are African nations truly free to defend their sovereignty, or are they still expected to comply when powerful interests demand it? The answer to that question may determine whether the continent continues to bleed or finally begins to heal. The tension reached its breaking point not with gunfire, but with words that traveled fast across the Sahel and far beyond it. When President Ibrahim Traoré declared that Burkina Faso would not retreat under pressure, many understood immediately that this was no ordinary statement. It was a line drawn in the sand, a moment of decision. And for a region long accustomed to quiet compliance, it felt explosive. If Nigeria believes it can invade our land, let them come, Traoré was quoted as saying. Burkina Faso is ready. We fear no one, and we will defend our sovereignty at all costs. Whether spoken as strategic deterrence or moral defiance, the message landed with force. This was not diplomatic language. It was raw, direct, and unmistakable. For supporters, it was the voice of a leader finally speaking without permission. For critics, it was a dangerous escalation that could spiral beyond control. Across West Africa, reactions were immediate and deeply divided. In Burkina Faso, many citizens felt a surge of pride. For the first time in years, they saw a leader who did not speak above them, but with them, someone willing to stand in the same storm they faced every day. Social media platforms lit up with messages of support, framing the statement as a defense not just of territory, but of dignity itself. To these voices, this was not about provoking war. It was about refusing humiliation. In Nigeria, the response was more complex. Some commentators emphasized Nigeria's role as a stabilizing force in the region, warning that inflammatory rhetoric could undermine fragile peace efforts. Others, however, questioned why Nigeria would risk confrontation with fellow African nations at a time when unity was desperately needed. The aircraft incident, once a technical matter, now symbolized something far larger, a test of power, influence, and allegiance. ECOWAS found itself under intense scrutiny. Officially committed to regional stability and constitutional order, the organization struggled to maintain the appearance of neutrality. Among supporters of the Alliance of Sahel States, doubts were growing louder. Could ECOWAS truly act as an impartial mediator when its decisions so often aligned with former colonial interests? Or had it become, in the eyes of many Africans, a tool through which external pressure was applied? International reactions added another layer of complexity. Western governments watched closely but cautiously, aware that overt involvement could inflame already volatile perceptions. Russia's growing presence in the Sahel, particularly through military cooperation and training, became a focal point of debate. For some, Moscow's involvement symbolized a break from one-sided dependency, a signal that Africa was no longer limited to a single set of partners. For others, it raised fears of a new form of influence replacing the old. Yet President Ibrahim Traoré was careful not to present Russia as a savior. The message coming from Burkina Faso was clear: partnerships would be chosen, not imposed. The Sahel was no longer waiting to be rescued. It was deciding for itself. That distinction mattered deeply to millions of Africans who had grown weary of narratives portraying their continent as helpless or perpetually dependent. As debates raged from Ouagadougou to Bamako, from Niamey to Accra, emotions collided. Fear and pride existed side by side. Some worried that firm language could invite retaliation or miscalculation. Others argued that silence had already cost too much, that decades of restraint had only encouraged further interference. For young Africans especially, this moment felt different. They were no longer passive observers. They were questioning old narratives, rejecting fear-based diplomacy, and demanding leaders who placed national interest above foreign approval. This was the climax of the story, not a battlefield confrontation, but a psychological and political rupture. Never before in recent history had a small Sahel nation spoken so openly, so boldly, against both regional and global power structures. Burkina Faso was not claiming invincibility. It was declaring that dignity was non-negotiable. And in doing so, it forced an entire continent to confront an uncomfortable truth. The greatest struggle Africa faces today is not only against terrorism or poverty, but against the fear of standing alone. Whether this moment leads to conflict or renewal remains uncertain. But one thing is clear: Africa is no longer silent, and the world is listening. As the rhetoric hardened and regional tensions deepened, the consequences began to ripple outward, first through politics and then through the lives of ordinary people. For civilians across Burkina Faso and the wider Sahel, this confrontation was not an abstract geopolitical debate. It carried real risks, real fears, and real sacrifices. In villages already scarred by years of insecurity, the prospect of escalation stirred painful memories. Families who had fled violence once before wondered if they would be forced to move again. Farmers questioned whether they could safely tend their fields. Traders worried that borders might tighten, cutting off fragile supply routes. Even without a single new shot, fired uncertainty itself became a burden. When nations edge toward confrontation, it is civilians who absorb the shock long before leaders do. At the same time, something else was happening beneath the fear, a shift in political consciousness. Across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, many citizens began to openly discuss sovereignty in ways that had once been reserved for elite circles. The standoff with Nigeria, and by extension ECOWAS, sparked conversations about dignity, independence, and the cost of silence. For supporters of President Ibrahim Traoré, the refusal to release the aircraft without proof was not reckless. It was symbolic. It signaled that African governments could enforce boundaries without seeking permission. Politically, the crisis placed enormous pressure on regional institutions. ECOWAS, already criticized for sanctions and threats of intervention against Sahel governments, now faced accusations of selective enforcement and double standards. To many in the Sahel, the organization appeared more willing to punish defiant states than to address the deeper causes of instability. This perception weakened its moral authority and widened the gap between regional leaders and the populations they claimed to represent. Nigeria, too, found itself navigating a delicate internal balance. While some voices emphasized strength and deterrence, others urged restraint, warning that confrontation with the alliance of Sahel states could fracture West Africa further. Analysts cautioned that any military escalation would not remain bilateral. It would inevitably draw in Mali and Niger, transforming a diplomatic dispute into a broader regional crisis, one with no clear winners. For President Ibrahim Traoré, the political stakes were equally high. Standing firm boosted his credibility among supporters who view him as part of a new generation of African leaders willing to challenge inherited power structures. But it also placed him under intense scrutiny. Every move, every word was now measured for signs of provocation or compromise. Leadership under such pressure leaves little room for error, especially in a region where miscalculation can have irreversible consequences. Perhaps the most profound impact, however, was psychological. Across Africa, young people watched closely. Many had grown cynical after decades of promises that never translated into change. This moment, tense, uncertain, and risky, felt different. It suggested that resistance did not always come with polite language or international approval. It came with consequences and with courage. Whether one agreed with Traoré's approach or not, it forced a reckoning with a long-avoided question: how much is sovereignty worth? Yet the danger remained real. History offers sobering lessons. When African nations are pushed into opposing camps, external powers often step back not to calm tensions, but to profit from them. Weapons are sold, resources are traded away, and later the same violence is cited as proof that Africans cannot govern themselves. Many voices across the continent warned against falling into that trap once again. This is why the civilian and political consequences of the current crisis matter so deeply. They reveal how quickly pride can turn into pain if unity collapses, but also how silence can be just as destructive. The path forward is narrow and unforgiving. It demands vigilance, dialogue, and maturity qualities that Africa has been denied the chance to exercise for far too long. Whether this moment becomes a turning point toward dignity or a descent into deeper division remains unresolved, but its impact is already undeniable. Africa is being tested not just militarily or diplomatically, but morally. And the choices made now will echo far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. From Washington, the unfolding tensions in West Africa may appear distant, even obscure. Yet for Americans, especially those who remember the Cold War, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, the pattern is hauntingly familiar. A region marked as unstable strategic interests, quietly at play, alliances shifting, and the constant risk that local conflicts become arenas for global power competition. What is happening in Burkina Faso is not isolated Africa news. It reflects a broader struggle over sovereignty, influence, and who gets to decide the future of nations. Officially, the United States continues to emphasize regional stability, democratic norms, and counterterrorism cooperation. These are understandable priorities. However, history has taught many Africans to listen not only to what is said, but to what is done. In places like Iraq and Libya, foreign intervention promised order and delivered chaos. In Afghanistan, decades of involvement ended with a rapid collapse that shocked even its architects. For Africans watching today, these examples are not distant memories. They are warnings. This is why the rhetoric coming from Burkina Faso resonates far beyond its borders. When President Ibrahim Traoré insists that dignity and sovereignty are non-negotiable, he is echoing a sentiment shared quietly by millions across the global South. The message is not anti-American. It is anti-dependency. Many Africans do not reject partnership with the United States or Europe. What they reject is a system in which partnership comes with obedience as an unspoken condition. Globally, Russia's expanding role in the Sahel has triggered intense debate. Western media often frames Moscow's involvement as purely opportunistic or destabilizing. Yet, from the perspective of many in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, Russia represents an alternative in a world that no longer feels unipolar. This does not mean blind trust, it means choice. And choice for nations long constrained by limited options is powerful. China too looms in the background, less vocal militarily, but deeply embedded economically across Africa. Infrastructure projects, loans, and trade ties further complicate the geopolitical landscape. Together, these dynamics reflect a shifting global order in which Africa is no longer a passive stage, but an active participant. The Sahel has become a mirror of the world's transition from dominance to competition, from certainty to negotiation. For Americans, this moment invites reflection rather than fear. The desire for sovereignty that now drives leaders like Ibrahim Traoré is not foreign to U.S. history. It mirrors America's own struggle against imperial control, its insistence on self-determination, and its deep suspicion of distant authorities dictating local realities. Understanding this parallel does not require agreement with every decision being made in West Africa. It requires empathy. At the same time, the risks are undeniable. When global powers compete, smaller nations often pay the highest price. Africans know this all too well. That is why many voices across the continent emphasize caution. Alliances must serve African interests, not replace one dependency with another. Sovereignty loses its meaning if it is traded away under a different flag. The world is watching Burkina Faso not because it is powerful, but because it is brave enough to speak openly in an era of careful silence. For the United States and the broader international community, the challenge is clear. Will Africa be treated as a partner capable of choosing its own path, or as a problem to be managed? The answer to that question will shape not only Africa's future, but the moral credibility of the global order itself. History rarely announces itself with certainty. More often, it whispers through moments of tension, difficult choices, and leaders who refuse to speak softly when silence feels safer. What is unfolding in Burkina Faso today is one of those moments. It is not simply a dispute over an aircraft, a border, or a political alliance. It is a test of whether Africa will continue to react to pressure or finally act on principle. The danger is real. Escalation would not stop at one border. A conflict between Nigeria and Burkina Faso would inevitably draw in Mali and Niger, pulling ECOWAS and the alliance of Sahel states into direct confrontation. Such a path would serve no African people. It would only confirm the darkest predictions of those who have long argued that Africa cannot manage its own destiny. Weapons would flow in, resources would flow out, and once again ordinary families would bear the cost. Yet there is another path, one that demands maturity rather than bravado, unity rather than division. President Ibrahim Traoré's message, stripped of rhetoric, is ultimately a warning, not a call to war. It is a reminder that sovereignty must be defended, but also protected from being consumed by pride. Africa does not need another battlefield. It needs honest dialogue rooted in mutual respect, not fear. This moment forces a broader question: who benefits when Africans fight? Africans' history provides a clear answer, and it is never the people. That is why voices across the continent are urging restraint, negotiation, and a recommitment to Pan-African unity. The future of Africa cannot be built on borrowed strategies or imported solutions. It must be shaped by Africans themselves, through institutions that listen, leaders who are accountable, and citizens who refuse to be divided. For those watching from the United States and beyond, this is not a story to consume passively. It is an invitation to reconsider long-held assumptions about Africa power and progress. The desire for dignity driving events in Burkina Faso is not radical. It is human. It echoes the same yearning that has shaped every struggle for independence in history, including America's own. The question now is not whether Africa is ready. The question is whether the world is ready to accept an Africa that speaks for itself, chooses its partners, and refuses to be a pawn on the global chessboard. Burkina Faso may be small, but the conversation it has ignited is enormous. So we leave you with this. Do you believe President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform and sovereignty-first approach can protect Burkina Faso without dragging the region into conflict? Or is Africa being pushed toward another cycle it has fought too hard to escape? Share your thoughts in the comments. Please share this video if you feel you are witnessing a turning point in Africa news. And subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines, because Africa is writing a new chapter and the world needs to pay attention.